Welcome to Elected to Lead, a webinar on women and democracy. This webinar is organized in connection to the Hunger Project's exhibition Elected to Lead at Etnografiska Museet. And that is a very nice exhibition. I've just been there to watch it myself. So if you have the possibility to go to Stockholm and watch it, please do. Otherwise, there is also a very nice book I imagine you can read. And actually, at this very moment, this webinar is shown in the auditorium at Etnografiska. My name is Anna Stenvinkel, and I'm the Secretary General of Forum Civ, which is Sweden's largest platform for organizations, and we are 177 members. This year marks the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage in Sweden, practiced for the first time in September of 1921. 5 women were elected to parliament then, and today 46% of the members of the parliament are women. And actually, the government also have a feminist foreign policy, which is something to be proud of. Women's political participation and leadership have paved the way for many important reforms for gender equality and justice. However, Sweden is still have some time ahead to reach gender equality and parity. Women politicians are discriminated against, and women must perform much better than men to make a political career. The fact that Sweden has so far never had a female prime minister is just one example of this. But as it looks now, we will have a female prime minister in the beginning of November, and that would be something to celebrate. The Gender Equality Authority states that young women are severely underrepresented in Swedish politics and leave their assignments prematurely. Why is that? In India, the constitution mandates that at least 1/3 of the seats at a local village council, Panchayats, are to be reserved for women. This has been a major step for gender equality, but in practice it has not always had the effect it was intended to have. Elected women representatives face threats and violence from both their own families and others who believe that women cannot or should not get involved politically. According to Amnesty International, women politicians in India are exposed to widespread hatred and threats on social media, not only because of their views, but also because of gender, religion, caste, and marital status. And this is unfortunately a trend we can see all over the world. Now we will have an hour when we're going to discuss this topic. And we will also then be speaking about women's democratic and political representation. What does women political representation look like in the world? How do we guarantee women's meaningful participation in politics and society at large? And today I will very soon introduce to you a very knowledgeable panel that we have with us. And these people in the panel will help us to answer some of these questions we have. And we will also have participants who will view this webinar from all over the globe. If you have any questions to the panel, please feel free to write them in the comment as a comment in the chat field. And we will constantly keep an eye, of course, on the chat, and we will be able to post the questions throughout the webinar. Okay, by this I would like to introduce to you our panel. I would like to start with Veda Bavrevadi. And Veda is the Senior Program Officer for the Hunger Project in India, where she has led the advocacy portfolio at the national and state level. Veda is particularly interested in gender and development and its intersection with politics, caste, and class. She is passionate about advancing women's and girls' rights and political participation, and is a firm believer that dialogue and engagement with policy is the only sustainable way to uphold rights, especially for the marginalized and vulnerable. Veda also manages the Hunger Project's Empowering Adolescent Girls portfolio. Welcome, Veda. Then I'm very proud also to present to you Rombidzai Kandawaswika Nundu. Rombidzai is the Senior Advisor of Democracy and Inclusion at International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, IDEA. She is a democracy and gender equality advocate and practitioner with several years of engagement on gender equality and women's empowerment in political systems and political parties, electoral systems and processes, constitutional building, political financing in politics, and parliamentary strengthening in Africa, Asia Pacific, Latin America, and the Caribbean. Most welcome to you as well. And then I'd like to introduce you Drude Dalerup. Drude is a professor emerita of political science at Stockholm University in Sweden and also at Roskilde University in Denmark. She has published extensively on gender and politics, quota systems, women's movements and feminist theory. She edited the first global overview over electoral gender quotas, women, quotas and politics in 2006. Drude has worked as an international advisor on women's political empowerment and gender quota system for United Nations and other international organizations in, for instance, Bhutan, Egypt, Kenya, Sierra Leone, and presently in Nigeria. Welcome to you as well, Drude.
Yeah, thank you.
And then I'd like also to present you Angela Refruso Larsson. Angela is the Secretary General of the Swedish civil society organization Maktsalongen. The goal of Maktsalongen is an equal society in which power and influence are fairly distributed. Maktsalongen works to ensure that more young women see themselves as leaders and challenge norms that narrowly define the image of power and leaders. Angela is practically committed to issues concerning non-profit organizations and movements, female leadership, working environments, and intersectionality. She has worked intensely with norm and critical methods and is an expert in questions concerning equality, young people's self-organization, and board work. Most welcome to you as well. So welcome all of you four. I do hope you feel comfortable and very energized now to start discussing this very important topic that we will discuss today. So we will actually start to talk about political representation. And I would start with you, Veda. How does the Hunger Project in India work to promote women's political representation?
Thank you, Anna, and thank you and welcome to everyone here. So I'll dive right in. So as you mentioned, there is a quota, a reservation of seats for women to contest local body elections. And with what started off as 33.33% has actually galvanized into a more 50% in almost 18 states in India out of 29 that we have. But like most of us know that, just by providing quotas doesn't automatically guarantee that you have equal participation in the political space. And so what THP in India does is that we are trying to, through our interventions, disband the notional value that is attached to quotas, and as well as to also look at women's empowerment in a more holistic way in terms of looking at not just women as political candidates who are contesting local body elections, but also to look at the environment in which they are actually exercising their right, political choice and right to contest elections. It has been more than 25 years since we've had the introduction of quotas. We have a whole strategic notion in which we believe that you build the capacities of these elected women, because one has to realize that most of these elected women who have assumed these leadership roles through quotas are also first-time entrants into a public space, let alone looking at as a public office holder. And your state institutions, mechanisms, your local functionaries, your bureaucrats, they're all male. It's a male-dominated sphere, whether you're looking at the local level, state level, or even at the national level. So what does Hunger Project do? What we do is that we build their capacities for the entire 5-year duration that they're elected for, because no one-off intervention can actually help them to realize their potential, because it's very important, because they've also been often told that, oh, because you're from a quota seat, you're just being nominated in a way, you don't really deserve this. And often what we try to challenge that status quo is by doing a lot of advocacy on it, in trying to change the narrative to say, hey, if you have been elected, even if you've been elected for reasons whatever, what are you going to do now that you've been elected for 5 years? because this is where your roles and responsibilities, as well as for you, what is it that you determine. So we listen to them, we hear the challenges, we hear their articulation of what kind of development they would like to see for the constituencies that they represent. And along with this, it's not just about the rights, it's also about your roles and responsibilities, because India, like all of us, there are plethora of schemes out there. Every day we have new schemes coming out about poverty, about social security, and again, coming back to the profile of the elected women we work with, there are illiterate women as well. So how do you break this down? So we do these adult participatory trainings with them, and we kind of break down the messaging with them, right? That, okay, this is what it means. If you are the president of your village council, these are the mandates, the roles that you have to exercise. Another key intervention that that we focus on is advocacy, and it is here to inform those policy processes which are looking into promoting women's political representation and participation. Currently, and to be very honest, that debate has kind of reached a standstill. There was this huge movement to demand for quotas, taking the learnings from the local village council level to have quotas, similar kind of quotas at the state and the national level. And there is a bill which is still pending in the Parliament of India, which is now lapsed. It's been more than 20 years. So to really take those learnings and to put it out there and say, change the narrative, not to just look at elected women as development actors, but to look at them as rightful public office holders who have been elected and who have contested elections as well. So this is what the Hunger Project in India is trying to do to promote women's political representation. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Veda. That's very interesting. And I have several things I want to pick up on straight ahead of all the interesting things we've been mentioning now. But let's move on first to Angela. And let us hear a bit about from what your perspective in Maktsalongen. How do you work with female representation?
Thank you. And thanks to all of you that are joining me in this panel. It's going to be a very interesting hour. So Maktsalongen, as Anna mentioned, is a Swedish nonprofit organization, and we're working for equality. And the goal is an equal society in which power and influence is distributed fairly. So our goal in this process is for more young women to see themselves as leaders. And to do that, you also have to challenge norms that frame what power looks like and also who can be a leader. So what Maktsalongen does practically is that we provide mentorship programs, educations, courses, and a network and a forum for young women that are or want to be leaders to get inspired, to network, and to grow. And we at Maktsalongen believe that if more young women get the tools that they need to fulfill their dreams of changing the world, we will also see more women on higher political positions overall. And we meet a lot of young women. I have the enormous privilege to have a job in which I meet around a couple of hundred women in the ages of 15 to 30 that aspire to be the leaders of the future. And what we do in that, with our work, we aim to create a space for these young women to collect strength and also to grow. And to get strength and network in the kind of society in which your dreams and your aspirations maybe aren't as celebrated in the way that it would be if you were, for example, a man. So that's a little bit about what we do.
Thank you. Also very, very interesting. And I would love also to dig into the challenges you see in this work, but we'll see if we can come into that perhaps a bit. Now I will ask you, Drude, in the research work you're doing, how do you work with female political representation? What have you seen in the research you have performed so far?
Well, thank you. I have worked with women's political representation for many years all over the world, and also back in time about doing research on women's suffrage. And I apart from doing research, I am also, as you mentioned, an international advisor for various countries, only on invitation. So I work for UN Women or for the Interparliamentary Union or other around the world on invitation, and only on invitation, how can we improve women's political representation, and what are the barriers here to be addressed? And of course, we have seen an enormous increase in women's representation. If we talk about the 1990s, women had about 10% of the seats in all the parliaments of the world, and today is 25, 26. That is 1/4. That means, of course, that women are still grossly underrepresented, and there's a lot of work to be done here. And I think that. Well, you can say that everywhere in every country in the world, almost, that politics is dominated by men from the dominant classes, and that from the dominant ethnic majority also. And there's a lot of work to be done to change this, right? And what I think is really important that we look both at what are the goals we're working on, what are the diagnoses of the problem, and what are the strategies. And many people are blaming the women, and sometimes I'm a little bit angry of all the education of women to improve women's representation. No, I'm not angry about it, but I think this cannot stand alone, because the major problem is, of course, that women are kept out of political representation. And so we have to work at the basic, but also at the power structure to increase women's representation. And there are big problems out there. And at one time, I thought that women's representation would just, increase, maybe take some time. But now we know that there are always backlash out there. And we have seen decreases in women's representation. So I think we have to be very careful about and work very hard about what to do here. And there are so many qualified women out there. There are so many qualified women. And the question is more that the political system is not open to women. All the discussion about women not being suited or not being qualified, that is just questions. There are so many active competent women in civil society that they can fill all the parliaments in the world. So it's a question of addressing all the barriers that women meet in the political system. There are so many active women out there. It's just giving a chance.
Thanks a lot. And that's very hopeful still, isn't it? That there are so many active women. It's just the way of how we would sort of break these barriers and how we will change the system. And this is also something I would sort of sit still on my chair here, not to be able to get into discussion already, because also now I would like to hear from you, of course, Rumbidzai, about your work and how you see this women's political representation. How are you working with it within your organization?
Thank you. And my inputs really will build on what all my colleagues have said. As International IDEA, our mandate is to advance democracy worldwide. And there is no way that we can talk about advancing democracy worldwide when women continue to be marginalized and excluded, and to a very large extent discriminated within the political, electoral systems. And the work that we do rightly resonates with some of the elements that Trude has just mentioned. The issue is not that women are failing to be leaders, but the issue is that we operate with political and electoral systems, but more so the political party systems, which are very patriarchal. And patriarchy, I want to say that from our perspective in terms of analysis, it's actually a non-monetary resource for men, because it's a system that gives privilege automatically to men. You are born male, therefore you are a competent leader. You are born female, you are not competent, you are incompetent. So the work of International IDEA gives particular attention on processes and institutions for democracy building. And there's no way we cannot interrogate how political parties function, how political systems function, the internal party democracy systems of political parties, which I will call the secret garden of nominations, when they nominate candidates and identify candidates. And in one of the publications that International IDEA did jointly, and at that time time, I'm sure, Drude, you remember it. One of the things we pointed out clearly was that political parties are the real gatekeepers of who gets elected into positions of power and decision-making at the different levels. So the work of International IDEA is invested in the transformation of political parties. It's not about adding in women. It's not about giving women seats. It's not about doing women a favor, but it's about ensuring that democratic processes are truly democratic. And if political party systems and our electoral systems is also something we need to look at. Why do we have electoral systems that keep reproducing and reproducing one gender and a particular group of men? And we talk about transfer of power and free and fair elections. Essentially, we mean transfer of power from one group of men to another group of men. It doesn't matter the extent to which women are excluded. So as International IDEA, we really invest in political parties, their internal workings, their rules and regulations and systems, the extent to which they should not entrench gender inequalities and be conduits for empowering women and making sure that we achieve gender equality. And in doing that, we do that together as well, combined with the electoral systems. And I'm sure we can talk more about some of the measures that can be put in place regarding what can be done within political parties and what can also be done legally in light of the electoral systems to ensure that they are enabling. And it's not about giving women a certain quota or a certain maybe token, but ensuring that they are enabling. The reason why women are not in positions of power in decision making is simply because we have very patriarchal political systems that promote the dominance of male leadership across the world.
Thank you. This is also very interesting, and I was sort of making quite a lot of notes here of what you said here last. And I just want to remind all of you in the audience that please post questions in the chat so we can answer them continuously if we have from you. Otherwise, of course, we also have. I would guess that all of you would perhaps like to comment on each other if you have any questions or any comments. So please, Angela, you were nodding. Do you want to comment anything on what your colleagues in the panel said?
It's very interesting just listening to what you just said, my fellow panelists. I don't have any specific questions right now, but I'll probably get to them if there's time later.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Anyone else who you want to comment on anything that your colleagues said? Yeah, through that, please.
Yes, I work very much with the question of the diagnosis of the problem. And I think many of my fellow participants touched upon this because for a very long time there's been a blaming of women for their low representation, which is a totally wrong direction of searching for this underrepresentation of women. So we have to look at those who control the nomination, as already been said. That is in most parts of the world, that's the political parties, of course. So what kind of processes is it that keep women out? And I think it's very important to look at the grassroots level and the mobilization of women there, but also at what is really happening in the top. And I think that sometimes when I go around as an advisor for International IDEA or for UNDP or other international organizations, or only on invitation. And I can mention the case of Bhutan, which is a beautiful country in the bottom of Himalaya. And when we came there, they all said the problem is that women don't vote for women. That is a big problem of women's underrepresentation. And then, of course, we asked, could we meet the Electoral Commission and see how the electoral statistics looks like? And it turned out that in 3/4 of the constituencies, there were no women candidates. So there were no women candidates to vote for. So how can you blame women for not being represented? So you have to move back one step and see who are controlling the nominations, as Rumbisai also said. Why are there so few women being nominated? And and especially being nominated in good districts with a good chance of winning. So if the diagnosis of the problem is totally wrong, then of course also the strategy for changing is totally wrong. And I looked at the statistics in Bhutan that in those 3/4, as I said, of the constituencies, there were no women candidates. The last quarter, there were both women and men candidates, and women's success rates were just as high as that men's success rates. So it was not because the voters didn't want women, it was because the political parties nominated within an old boys network, if we excuse me for that phrase. So it's very important to see what is really the problem here and have a real good diagnosis of the problem and not a wrong one. Don't blame women for women's underrepresentation. Blame those who control the nominations for election.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Yes, Veda, please.
Yeah, an interesting point. In our experience working with women elected in the village council. So the village council elections are not fought on political party lines. So it's basically individual candidates who go up and of course, but they are increasingly so. There is a lot of influence of political parties, especially now that we have so much of funds coming through to the village councils, and it's a huge deal. What is interesting, and in our experience, has been the kind of strategies that these elected women have been adopting. So also to not just look at the formal spaces of how politics are functioning, but also to look at the informal spaces as to how women, despite all the norms and the status quo and the patriarchy that exists, are still able to make their way or forge their way forward. So collectives is definitely an important tool that they have. But at the same time, and when we have often spoken to them, and we've also been asked that, why don't you engage with male representatives, or why don't you engage with men, which is, that question will always come up when you're working on women's rights and advancing women's rights and girls. We often tell them that, look, and we ask the elected women, what do you think that the answer, or what do you think about this? They're like, what makes you think that we don't work with men? What makes you think we don't engage with them? Your entire bureaucracy is male dominated. But at the same time, not to give away these kind of support that they get sometimes from their family, sometimes from their husbands. But there are strategies. It's not been easy, and it continues to be difficult. But again, coming back to when we are looking at women's representation in the higher offices, which is less than 15% in India, when you look at women's political participation, when you look at the voters, women outvote men in at least three of the most populous states in India, which is Bihar and Madhya Pradesh. So it's a paradox which is there. But at the same time, yes, the political parties are gatekeepers. But I think we also need to delve a little bit more into looking at informal spaces and what are those strategies that these women are adopting, the elected women, whether it's at grassroots or even at the higher tiers of offices.
Great, thank you so much. Yes, Rumbid Sai, please, also, if you want to comment.
Thanks. Yeah, I think one of the observations and important aspects we need to address, if I can borrow from what Ruta was saying about the diagnosis of the problem, is the very fact that increasing women's participation and representation and women's political empowerment, the bottom line is about redistribution of power. And we know the resistance that we see, the pushback, is essentially about those who have power, who, according to societal cultures, attitudes and traditions and upbringing, are almost entitled to be leaders. So how many of those benevolent men are there? How many do we have good benevolent men who are willing to give up power? That's one thing I just want to underline. The issue is about redistribution of power, and also, let me say, and privileges. And this is where culture, religious interpretations, and all the dynamics, which I will call semi-autonomous social fields, which we can't qualify, but have a tremendous effect, still take the toll, and it has an impact and affects women's political participation and representation. Because the argument in terms of demographics to say women are 50-50 of any population or even more, therefore they should vote for each other, I think it's a very limited argument, and it doesn't hold water. It doesn't hold very well. Because I would turn it the same in another way and say, if we look at the youthful population around the world, in terms of demography, we have very young people who are politically active and interested to be in politics between the ages of 18 and 35. But however, look at the representation of young people across the world, it's not more than 2%. Just in parliament, you take all the about 45,000 members of parliaments across the world, only 2% are people under the age of 35. So demography is not the issue. It's the mindsets, it's the political systems that are entrenched in political parties. I recall at some point when I was in South Sudan, we were dealing with political parties, and one of the issues that was mentioned is that the kitchen in the home has just been shifted into the political party. What was that supposed to mean? It was supposed to mean that women continue to do the cooking, the functions of serving within political parties, just as they are expected to be doing at home. That has just shifted to the party. And we say they are participating, but they are participating in what? Ways that participation translating into representation and into voice and into influence. And what prevents that from happening? That's one of the things we need to unpack and interrogate. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, that is definitely something we need to look more into. What would women actually do when taking seat in different positions, of course. We have a question from the audience, actually, and this is something I know we have been talking about before, and this is also something that could be something that people say yes to, people say no to. So this will be very interesting to hear all of you have a bit of a reflection about what's to think of quotas. Affirmative action, is that a recommendation that is put out there or not? Who would like to start that? Rude, yes, please go.
Yes, I have worked on gender quotas in politics for many years. When I started 10 years ago, I thought I would work on this subject for 2 or 3 years, but here I am. And together with many of you, we have been working on this for so many times. And today, more than half the countries in the world are applying some kind of gender quota system. It could be that they have reserved seats, like in India, and a special number of seats are reserved for women. It could be a law saying there should be, for instance, 30% candidates or 40% candidates, or it could just be political parties voluntary using some kind of quotas, like we have it in Sweden, for instance. First we have to go behind this barrier saying, oh, it's discrimination of men, right? Which is, of course, it is not, because right now you have informal quotas, as some of you said, for men. It's much more easy for a man to become a candidate than it is for a woman. And so we have many barriers for women here. So quotas is just trying to set things right and give women the opportunity of participating. And there are many different kind of quotas, and it has to be adapted to the electoral system in place to make it work. Just ask me I can construct a quota system which doesn't work, and I can construct one which absolutely works beautifully. And right now, as I said, it's more than half of the countries in the world who are using some kind of gender quota system in order to break male dominance. And it seems that in the start, people would say that this is unfair to men. But if you say that what the diagnosis of the problem is that men are appointing other men in an old boys network, then quotas is a remedy to set things right. It's a remedy to make justice so that both men and women and also other underrepresented groups get into the system. But it's very important to look at which kind of quota system you are working with, because there are so many different quota systems. But quotas, gender quotas, is not discrimination of men. Men are is absolutely a question of trying to do have a more just representation system. Women are half the population and should have half the positions if there were not barriers against women. So this is absolutely the thing. I mean, as I said, more than half of the world, the countries in the world are using some kind of quota system. And it's all kind of regime systems. It's democratic, it's semi-democratic, authoritarian regimes are using quota system. It is really the last 20 years. This is, that's why I thought that when I was studied that for about 1 or 2 years, and now I'm done that for so many years because it's so quick. It's really a remedy that works, but it only works, of course, on the numerical representation. But I think that maybe that's a good idea to distinguish those two things. I mean, the number of women and also what kind of policy comes out of it. And we know that more women than men works on gender equality issues, right? But if you say we're talking about the number of women and we want to improve and we want to have parity, then all women can work together, even if they disagree on the political matters. So it's something that I recommend that you say, okay, in this kind of work, we say it's about gender equality, and then afterwards you can talk about what you're going to use this for, even if it's difficult to make a distinction. But that is really something that women can agree upon, and lots of men are also supporting this.
Thank you. And also with what you said in the beginning, Drude, about there are so many competent women out there, that's not the problem. So then it's even more fair, of course. And I love the way you put it, quotas is a way to set things right. That says it all, I would say. Anyone else of you want to comment on this with quotas? Oh, yeah, very good, all three of you. So let's start with Angela this time.
Yes, thank you all. I just had a quick reflection when listening to you, Drude. We at Maxalongen, we meet a lot of young women in the beginning of, for example, their political careers, and they're chosen to be part of the youth parties in Sweden. And I remember a discussion with, I think it was about 10 young women. All of them got chosen to different kind of positions in youth parties in Sweden. And they told me about the nomination process in which they got chosen in. And a lot of them, a majority of them, didn't understand how the nomination committee worked, because of the fact that they kind of believed that you couldn't candidate in the same way, that you were supposed to just wait for the nomination process. And just continuing what some of you said before, that the nomination committee was filled with a lot of young men, and they chose, or they contacted other young men that they found similarities to in the process. So and if women do not understand that you have the right to candidate, you have the right in these youth parties, it starts very young, then I think I will just agree with what Drude said about quotas being a remedy in which we can establish equality in all different ages.
Great, thank you. That's very interesting also what you talked about this with young people joining the youth political groups as well to be able to affect change. Thank you. All right, so Rombitsai, what would you be your reflection about quotas?
Thank you. Just to build on what my colleagues have said, I would say if society was gender fair, there wouldn't be any need for quotas, because precisely quotas are meant to address the representation gap and make sure that the burden and responsibility for facilitating and ensuring equal participation and representation of women and men in positions of power and decision making at all levels, it's not just a burden for women, because women, we know the difficulties that they encounter if, for instance, we talk even about access to campaigning, funds for campaigning. Of course, in countries like Sweden, Finland, and Norway, the political context is very different. and also the availability of resources to political parties is very different. But if I'm to speak from examples of several African countries, it's a burden. It's a financial burden just to even consider or think of yourself as a candidate as a woman, to think of yourself as a candidate, to present yourself as a candidate to a political party, let alone the roadblocks or obstacles that emanate within political parties. So at the end of the day, it's important to understand that quotas are not about bringing in, I've heard so many times that it's about wheelbarrowing incompetent women into positions of power and decision making without understanding the entire political and electoral systems and social cultural systems that shape our societies, and the impact it has on women's ability to just even consider themselves to be candidates for leadership. That is not to say women are not leaders. You'll find at community level where there is just volunteering, there is no monetary benefits or gains that come with it. Women are so crowded there, and no one questions why women are volunteering to keep and sustain communities and leading communities. But where there's any monetary gain and access to power, the roadblocks become numerous. So you find even when women are so much involved, being the foot soldiers of political parties, mobilizing, being free billboards for political parties, putting on the regalia of political party symbols on their bodies, advertising for political parties, that is not in any way matched with their representation now in positions of power and decision making. And quotas are just one aspect that can help, because there's still a lot that needs to be done in terms of transformation of mindsets and perceptions, views towards women's leadership and male leadership, which is also perpetuated in the media. If you look at when a woman candidate is campaigning, the media, the things that they focus on, they drive the hate speech and the inequalities, and also even in our educational systems. So quotas are just one approach, but they need to be reinforced by so many other multidimensional measures within our societies for the transformation of mindsets and perceptions. Thank you.
Thank you a lot. Also, very interesting things here that you brought up with when we have money gain and access to power, then it's when the trouble begins, right? Very interesting. Veda, what would be your takings on this?
Yeah, no, I agree with fellow panelists. Quotas are definitely important because it just wears down the resistance of your sitting MPs and MLAs, male MPs and MLAs, and it helps. And also in the context that of, say, India, that women are not, or even across the world, women are not a homogeneous group. So and all women don't face identical circumstances. So when you have quotas, it kind of just gives you that kind of access and also a space for women from belonging to different groups, marginalized groups, caste groups, class, ethnic, to be on the same level playing field to contest elections. So and I think one of the most important things that we have seen in our work, where we work with the adolescent girls in the village councils, is the role modeling effect it has. When you see 50% of your representation as women, it definitely builds an idea that I can also go on to contest elections. Otherwise, think about it. Like, we've had instances of, and you must have seen it in the exhibition as well. If not, then please do. There's this girl who won elections who's like 23 years old, Lakshmi, and this is the first time she was contesting. So she has different ideas about what she wants to do in her village, the kind of development narrative she wants to see, and quotas is exactly what gave her that opportunity to access and to actually say, you know what, let me try it. And of course, there will be challenges. That's besides the point. But the point is that the fact that she could contest or think about contesting is because there was quotas for her to in the village council to contest. So I think it's a very definitely something that needs to be pushed more and more, because that has the relevance of it will always remain. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much for this. We could sort of conclude that all of you are very unanimous about that quotas is something that we definitely need if we should sort of fix things, to set things right, as you put it, Rude. I think that's an excellent way of putting it. We have another question from the audience, but before that, quotas is one way of fixing things right, but would there be any other tools that we could do? You have been talking about the barriers within the political parties as gatekeepers, a system that is built by men for men. We also have, of course, we haven't even touched upon the social structures with what's expected of a woman in the house or a man in the house, and to be able to make a career and so on. So what else can we do to quotas is one tool, one method. Would you see any other tools to sort of address the situation here? Drude?
Yes, I agree, and it's very important to say that quota is a means which has proved to be effective, right? We don't have to wait 100 years, right, for women's parity in politics. But it's not. It can never stand alone. And that's maybe a misunderstanding sometimes. You say you make a quota system, then everything is fine. Of course it's not. There are lots of prejudice against women after the election. And there are a lot of well, first we have to work with this. And people are saying, oh, if you're elected on a quota, you're not qualified. You want a quota women. And we have to do that again and again and again. And the most important thing is to say, how were the men elected? And how qualified are the men? Come on, because there is a male structure where men recruit other men, which means that those women who come in here, there's so many qualified women out in civil society, as was just mentioned, right? There's so many. I mean, there are qualified women to fill all the parliaments in the world, and we are only asking for 50%. But then, of course, it's very important to make support groups behind the women, not because women are not as qualified as men, but because there are more barriers against women because of being women. So support groups supporting those women, for instance, having a group of 5 or 6 people just following what is going on, because you can be very lonely once you are elected, and people think, well, why don't they make more of a difference? I mean, we really have to look at the barriers. Also, the sexual harassment in politics. We don't believe it. We didn't believe it, maybe, but of course, there are lots of sexual harassments in politics, and therefore, there have to be a responsibility by the leaders of those institutions, be it local councils or regional councils or parliament, to take sexual harassment within those structures very, very, very serious. But let's just start from the point of view that, of course, the women are just as qualified. I mean, there are some people say this, that equality is when you have just as many not very qualified women as you already have lots of not qualified men in any. Well, the question of qualification is, of course, it's not a question of qualification or higher degrees. It's a question of representation. That's a question of, do they represent people, no matter what kind of education you have? So, no, quota is just one, but it has proved to be extremely effective if it suits the electoral system in place. And we can just make historical jumps like Rwanda has done, Bolivia has done, Nicaragua has done. Whereas in the Scandinavian countries where I come from, and many of you live in, it's kind of what we call the slow track. It took 100 years, and people are saying, it doesn't have to take 100 years. You can make jumps in history by using what we call the fast track, the model, making a quota system. I think the Indian example is fantastic. I mean, 1/3 of the Panchayat members in a very patriarchal countryside. And of course, then the next question is, how do they get power to change what is? And we have lots of good studies of India that there are success stories and there are bad stories. And let's stop this kind of saying, oh, there's so many women in Rwandan parliaments and they don't make any difference. That is not the question. The question is, when are the conditions optimal for both men and women, minority, majorities, to act as political leaders? And that is the question. There are, as I said, enormous amount of qualified women in civil society who can fill all the parliaments in the world and all the local councils. And maybe we should stress again, there are about 70 countries who have quotas for the local level. India, of course, being the most famous one. And maybe we should look a little bit more on all this kind of quota system at the local level, because sometimes you can even have a 50-50 quota without people complaining and without men complaining about it, because it feels more natural at the local level. 72 countries have local quotas, and we need that in all countries in the world.
Yes. Thank you. All very interesting things again here to pick up on. But I will let you talk now, Rambitsai, because you also wanted to add on things that we can do beside the quota system.
Yes, thank you so much. From the work that we are doing as International IDEA, one of the critical measures that we believe has to be implemented in combination with quotas and all the other initiatives that we have mentioned, whether it's awareness raising, is the gender-targeted public funding. Why are we saying that? From the work that we do on money in politics and political financing, you find that the database that we have collected, it's about 480 countries, and 70% of these 180 countries have provisions for public funding to political parties. But out of that, only 17% of that is targeted to gender or to women's empowerment. For instance, if I give the example of Finland, which was like probably the first country to introduce that in 1974. And yet, if countries could reform their political finance laws and regulations to also enforce women's inclusion and participation and tie it up or earmark it to public funding that political parties receive, I think it would also be another effective measure. Of course, maybe some political parties, it will also depend on the extent to which the amount of money that a political party receives from the public coffers really makes a significant difference. Otherwise, political parties also might just ignore it and not comply it if the money doesn't really matter. Like, for instance, if I take the example of Sweden, there's money that is assigned to the women's wings in political parties. And we know most countries, political parties across the world have got women's wings. But the question is, what are the purposes and functions of those women's wings? Can they serve as conduits for women's empowerment and presenting women candidates so that political parties have no excuses to say we can't find the women? Because you always hear those kind of simplistic arguments that we can't find the women, even though women are there in the political parties and making political parties functional. So over the years, I think it's one of the aspects that we need to do a lot of advocacy on and investment in. If political parties are receiving public funds, that should be tied up or earmarked to their responsibility on women's empowerment and ensuring that women can be there as candidates with just also adequate resources. It's part of leveling the playing field to some extent, and I think it will contribute in some way, because one of the major obstacles across the world for many women is the issue of access to resources, financial resources, compared to men who already have naturally, culturally, traditionally, historically, have resourced networks, which most women don't have across the world, unless, of course, they are coming from privileged or advantaged families and communities.
Thanks a lot. And this is a very interesting idea, of course, to earmark these contributions of finance to see how we could do that. That's a very, very good idea. And I was also thinking when you talked about here, Rambitsai, about finding women to the position, then also about what connected to also what you said, Rude, about that would be sexual harassment and so on, because we also need to keep women that join politics, because quite a few are resigning for these because it's a so harsh environment. So this is also something, just when it's just not to get them in, it's also to make them stay there. That's something that's super important. Angela and Veda, I didn't see if you raised your hand and also wanted to comment about other things here. Did you, any one of you?
I just want to bring to the table, and it's not something which is clear in our heads as well, is the whole coming to money and financing, because it's so expensive and it's so where are the resources, the financial resources for women if they do contest elections, is interesting to see that how in India you have if women do get to contest elections in the higher tiers of governance, most of the candidates belong to the privileged, the dynasties, the dynastic politics and the role that it has played. And this is an opinion that I have, that, it's just a personal opinion, that I think in terms of patterns of representation that we see over a period of time, it surely do we need to recognize it as one way of actually women's political representation as being increasing, because of course then you're looking at a certain kind of women only assuming political office, or in terms of the whole concept of political representation, it's okay if, again coming back, either you come through quotas, or if you're from a privileged background, what matters is that women are in places of position and power. But there has been a lot of backlash here as well, because often that is held against us when you see women as members of parliament and all. Oh, this is from a privileged background. Oh, this is so. The whole idea, the whole thing about intersectionality and where does all of this fit in? So it's quite a complex thing. But to keep it simple, I believe that this is another way of women actually accessing political office, if it's through dynasties or from the privileged backgrounds. But yes, how do you, coming back to even when you have quotas, how do you effectively realize what the quotas were meant for, which is to have inclusion and have a more inclusive processes for these women to access. So just wanted to make that point here. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. We also have now the question from the audience I would like to post as a last thing, because we just have 3 minutes left of the webinar now. So we would, if any of you would like to answer or comment on this question, how to increase unity among women, that women support women and less compete with each other. Angela, you are nodding. Do you want to comment on this one?
I would love to. This is, I think, Max Longen or my organization, and also it's a very important question for myself. I think that we have a lot to gain in trying to create social structures in which that women empower women. And basically, I think you can do that by, for example, we have a mentorship program in which we pair a more senior leader with a more young woman that aspires to be a leader. But I think mentorship is a very important thing to do and to have, because you have to have role models and not only talk about representation, but also having the opportunity to mirror yourself in someone that's older and that's a leader. Because so we at Max Salongen, I think all of you guys know that young women aspire to be great leaders, but it's also not only having the idea and the dream, it's also how do you get into these very closed rooms of power. How do we open those doors? And I think that we can do that together by creating networks, by creating mentorship programs, and also just supporting each other and breaking barriers from different branches or organizations. And I think just starting networks is a very important thing by doing so.
Great, thanks a lot. We have, I think, if you're very short, both Drude and Rumbutsai, we can talk to both. Drude, very short.
Well, very short, two answers. It's an interesting question. The first is, of course, that I think that if you stress the numerical representation, you can have and not discuss what you're going to use this representation for. You can have a broader coalition of women, because this is against the exclusion of women, right? Then about competition between women, and I mean that you have to have competition between women. To go into politics is that you stand for competition, right? And reserve seats for women. For instance, the Indian one or the Bangladesh one or any of them are that you have competition between women, and it's because those seats are reserved for women, and we shouldn't be afraid of that, because it's very important that you get those seats through an election and not through an appointment, as you did in the old days. So there are competition. This reserved seats only among women, but most other elections are only competition between men, and therefore reserved seats are absolutely necessary at any rate in a temporary thing. So competition, yes, but also unity among women on the issue of getting women in.
Thank you. And Rombudsai, very short, you have the last word.
Thank you. I just wanted to say unity of purpose. I think that's important, unity of purpose. But we also don't want to assume that women are a homogeneous group. So we can also not overlook our diversities. It doesn't mean that when we just disagree on a particular aspect or compete with each other, we become enemies. So there are aspects where, because of the messaging, because of the agenda, there's unity of purpose, but that doesn't mean that because we disagree and we compete, as Drude said, this is how the political processes are set up, it doesn't mean and make us enemies of each other at all. In fact, that narrative has to change, because women are competing with each other. It doesn't mean that they are each other's enemies. Thank you.
True, very true. All right, this hour passed very, very quickly, I must say, and I would like to say a very warm thank you to the panelists for sharing your experiences and knowledge. I have so many topics now I want to continue to talk to you about, and I think definitely we need to do a follow-up of this one way or another. And I also want to thank all of you for listening to this. And this is, of course, a very, very, very important topic. So let us all continue to talk about elected to lead women and democracy. And we will get back on this topic for sure. Thanks a lot and have a lovely day.
Thank you.
Thank you.